I'd like to welcome you to tonight's meeting of the Historical Society of South Australia tonight to talk to us about a celebration of silver in South Australia. Would you please welcome Richard Phillips, who is a technical officer with the Bureau of Meteorology.
Thank you very much. Actually, my particular interest in silver, and especially Australian silver, was sparked in about 1973 by an exhibition when around the time of the Opera House opening, and Sydney dealer was asked to mount an exhibition of English silver to celebrate this great event, and he couldn't see much point, but he said, why not Australian, because there's never been an exhibition of that and no one knew much about it. And the National Trust Women's Committee in New South Wales mounted that exhibition, and theirs was the first comprehensive book on the subject, which John Hawkins of Sydney at that time edited. And he sparked my interest, and we corresponded from then on. And this is a bit of a journey through some of the things that I've come across over the last 25 or so years. When South Australia was settled by the British, silver was part of everyday life in England, particularly for the well-to-do, but also for smallholders and farmers and shopkeepers who came out here. They may not have had great amounts, but pretty well every family of any standing would have had spoons for use at the dining table and so on. Now this silverware that they used was made by silversmiths, and the metal it was made from was a silver sterling alloy, which is a particular percentage, 92.5% silver, which was the same as a currency. And as a result of this close tie-up between currency, because it was almost a surrogate currency, there were quite strict laws running back to at least the year 1300 governing the marking and the making of silverware. And because of this, the silverware which people used in England and brought with them had a series of marks on it which showed who was responsible for making it, usually the town that it had been assayed in, and also the year in which it had been assayed, so that if it was found out later that someone had watered the stuff down, they could pin the road down. When the silverware makers started making it in Australia, they used similar stamps. They didn't have the same regulations covering them, but it was a sort of a comfort factor. People were used to these stamps of crowns, lines and whatever, and also it was something of a guarantee by the maker. So as well as having the marks on, most pieces had ownership initials, inscriptions, presentation inscriptions on them, and when these are rubbed off, of course, you lose a great deal of history from it, even a simple spoon. Last year one was sold at auction here at Small and Whitfield's on Unley Road, and it was just a bent small dessert spoon, but it had a paper tag on it, and that mentioned that in the year 1804, when James Way was born in England, he had the spoon put in his mouth, so he wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and they made darn sure it got there soon enough. He became a reverend and migrated to South Australia, and he's best known through his son, Samuel Way, who became Sir Samuel Way. And this spoon was passed down through the family and then eventually popped out into the market, and if it hadn't had that tag on it, it just would have been suitable for the scrap bucket, but I think because it still had the tag, it's a very interesting piece of social history. More imposing pieces of silverware were currently given, or usually given, and the phrase that springs most readily to mind, which we hear over and over again in the 19th century, is when things were given as a gesture of respect and esteem. And before the colonists even left England, and this was March 1836, there was a very grand silver vase or covered cup presented to Lieutenant Colonel Robert Torrens by John Morfett on behalf of a group of intending colonists. So they hadn't even left the place and they were already celebrating and passing out the silverware. I don't know if that piece ever came to Australia. It was certainly an English-made piece, probably stock, but they had the foresight to put a kangaroo as a finial on the lid. The colonists came and they got their way through the reed beds and the mosquitoes and the dust and built their little bit of England on the shores of the Gulf. And in 1838 it was, Joseph Horden made the first crossing overland bringing livestock into South Australia to Adelaide. And the public, as a gesture of respect and esteem, mounted a subscription to raise money to thank him for doing this. And what they chose to do was buy him a snuff box, which was a very popular small personal presentation, very commonly given in that sort of circumstance. And that would have been an English piece, or possibly it could have been made in one of the other colonies, Van Diemen's Land or Sydney, but nowhere else in Australia could that have been made at the time. After that, in 1839, at the start of 1839, Dr. Samuel Miles was preparing to leave Cheshire. He was the local doctor, and could see a future in Adelaide, and his friends gathered together to present him with a cup with an inscription on it, which he could use in his new home and also have on the mantelpiece to show people that he was of some standing in the place that he'd originated. And that cup became part of the collection of the British Medical Association in Australia and is now on loan, I think, or certainly in the keeping of Adelaide University on North Terrace. Robert Gouger, the first colonial secretary, was caught in the frequent fights between Hindmarsh and Colonel Light. And in among all the bun fights, he had his own, and he struck Osmond Gillis, the first colonial treasurer, and was suspended as a result. And because of his suspension, he headed back to England to lay his case to why he should be reinstated, and he was successful, and of course Hindmarsh was recalled. And when Gouger came back, a group of his friends gathered together, took up a subscription and presented him with a suitable piece of plate. And here I'll explain that plate was a commonly accepted term up until quite recently for vessels and utensils made out of silver and gold. It's lost its currency now because electroplate has steamrolled the whole thing. But Gouger came back and was given this suitable piece of plate. It was a table centrepiece, and it turned up in New Zealand about 25 years ago. It was bought by an enterprising dealer, and the National Trust in South Australia bought it, and it now sits on a table at Ayres House. That same year, Charles Sturt retired from the survey department, and his friends wanted to present him with something, and they gave him what was called a silver vase, but we would probably call a punch bowl, again an English piece, and that sits on a table down at his cottage at the Grange. At this stage we did have our own watchmakers and jewellers at work, but they were mainly maintaining survey equipment and fixing up people's watches, and very little new things would have been made. If anything, would have been very small items of jewellery. But in 1840, the new Corporation of Adelaide needed a seal for their documents, and they went to the firm of Wainwright and Box, and you can see Wainwright and Box premises on the screen. William Wainwright was a watchmaker, clockmaker and engraver, and Alfred Bock was a jeweller, and they had a very short-lived partnership in Hindley Street for about 2 years. They also engraved in the same year the copper plate which was used to print an invitation to a testimonial dinner for David McLaren, and their shop is said to have been the first one in Adelaide with glass window panes. Then in 1842 an advertisement appeared calling for people to raise a subscription to buy a snuff box for Colonel Gawler. The wheal Gawler Mine, which we all know up at Mt Osmond, had been sputtering along and had recently looked as if it really was going to make some money at that stage. It was being worked vigorously, and the idea was that ore from the mine would be bought, sent to England and refined there, and then made in England into a presentation snuff box for Gawler. We don't know if that ever actually took place, but no one in Adelaide at that stage was capable of going through that whole process. Then, late in 1842, John Henry Pace appeared, and he's the first jeweller or silversmith we know of in Adelaide whose shop produced and marked silverware, even if he may not necessarily have made it with his own hands at the bench. He'd come from London. He set himself up at 3 Rundle Street. He'd had about 10 years in the jewellery trade in London, and he brought with him imported stock. And from him, quite possibly the first trophy cup we know of that was won for horse racing in Adelaide was bought. That was in 1845. He sold around that time some silver to the Davenport family, and we know this because we have here a set of egg spoons. They would have been made sometime in the mid-1840s, and they've got the shop marks or the hallmarks of John Henry Pace on them. But what's of even more interest, if we can, is the crest engraved on the handle. It's the crest of a savage or a wild man with a rope around his neck, and it was a crest used by the Davenport family and very, very few other ones. It seems likely that this was commissioned by the Davenport family, and we know that the Davenports shopped locally because in a letter back home to his father in Oxford in 1846 in November, Samuel said to his father, "I've got for you a set of shirt studs made of the native gold. Your crest is engraved on them." Then in March 1847, the first fully fledged goldsmith, silversmith and jeweller arrived. And for general purposes, goldsmith and silversmith are interchangeable terms. It's just the term goldsmith tends to be the older one, and it's fallen out of use. This was Charles Edward Fernharbour, who had sailed from Bremen. He also advertised that he did dental work, which was quite a common conjunction of trades at the time. and quite possibly he worked for John Henry Pace when he arrived, because only about 2 months after he arrived, this little cup was presented in Adelaide. It was presented to a James Miller, a child, and it was a parting gift from his father. It only stands about 9.5 centimetres high. It may have been Robert Miller, who was a merchant in Adelaide. We don't know the circumstances exactly, but that was presented on the 18th of May 1847, going by the inscription. And shipping records of the day show that the barque Phoebe, 2 days later, left for London carrying a Mrs. Miller servant and child. And I'd say it's a fair bet that James Miller was the child. William Pybus was an iron founder in Adelaide, and his foundry was on the corner of Lee Street and Hindley Street. And some of the early illustrations of Adelaide show the smoke streaming from there. Looks like it's coming from behind Trinity Church. William Pybus set up the Victoria Ironworks there, and he was also a member of the lodge. And in 1848, he'd done his term as Grand Master or whatever it was of his Oddfellows Lodge, and as a token of their respect and esteem, his fellows who met at the Apollo and Hercules in Gillis Arcade presented him with that medal to wear as a lodge jewel. And some of our best surviving relics are lodge jewels, and you'll see a number of them here. This was also the year of a much grander presentation. Colonel and Mrs. Gawler gave to the new St George's Anglican Church at his town of Gawler a massive silver communion service, which I've been trying to gain access to for years and haven't managed to, but which is pretty likely to have been a stock English one. Charles Fernharbour, we can see there, made that, and he also made a lot of other material for lodges over the next 25 or so years. Captain Frome, the Surveyor General, was leaving for England in 1849, and he was given a silver vase of elaborate workmanship, about 40 centimetres high, and on the lid, in frosted silver, a kangaroo in the act of saltation, which threw a lot of people, just means springing. And this came from the jeweller in Rundle Street, George Griffin, who ran a shop there for about 9 or 10 years. But most likely it was an English piece which was adapted for the presentation. And in 10 years' time on the screen we'll see just such another piece. 1850 marked a marvellous flowering of the art of the gold and silversmith in Adelaide. Julius Schomburg arrived. He was following by a year his brothers Richard and Otto, who had come out and settled at Gawler River at the property they called Buxfeld. He was a highly qualified goldsmith, and this was also the year of the consecration of Christ Church, North Adelaide. Now, when Augustus Short, the first Anglican Bishop of Adelaide, had come out in 1847, he brought with him a chalice. And this chalice had been designed by William Butterfield, who was a high Gothic revival designer and also architect in England. And in fact, his plans were the original plans for St Peter's Cathedral. So Short bought his Butterfield designed chalice, which had been made by a London firm, and when the congregation of Christ Church wanted to furnish their church with appropriate communion plate, they had this copied by Fernharbour. So he made 2 chalices and 2 matching patens, all copying the English ones which Short had brought out. And then they also had a flagon, sacramental flagon made, and that again was following a Butterfield design. And to commemorate it, and it was a wonderful thing for us that they did, the list of subscribers they've hung up in the vestry of the church, and it details all the subscribers, how much they gave towards their church, and then detailed the payments to Mr Fernharbour for making, and for Joshua Payne for doing the engraving. And we'll run against Joshua Payne a bit later on too. The church was a very good patron for the jewellers and silversmiths of Adelaide, but so were the publicans. Where's Patricia? And George Coppin had a lot of theatrical interests. He was regarded as the father of Australian theatre, but he also had the Royal Exchange Hotel. And he was busily promoting the Adelaide races for 1850, whether just because of the takings over the bar associated with it, I don't know. He had a stand erected for his patrons, and he donated the Royal Exchange Cup, which I think is still in the family ownership in Adelaide, of the family that won it. His stand collapsed, and the following year it wasn't his Royal Exchange Hotel, it was Schmidt's. Mr Schmidt had bought it, and the next year Mr Schmidt donated a cup. Oops, there's a Christchurch chalice, I forgot about that one. And that's an engraving from the Mercury of the time showing Schmidt's cup. It's very much, when you look at pieces of Fernharbour material, it's very much a Fernharbour design. We go on from that from the Schmidt Cup. This was also the year that the Adelaide Lodge gave Dr. George Mayo a lidded cup for his offices as surgeon to the lodge, and the Adelaide Gallery was given that by the Mayo family this century. And then this cup, which may well have been a chalice, it certainly didn't originally have a lid of its own, and it's just inscribed in memory of an esteemed friend, and Adelaide 1851. And again, another fine, chunky, bold piece of Fern Harbour silverware. Now this takes us to the period of the gold rushes. The gold rushes, of course, nearly stripped the state of its available labour, and there were diabolical problems running any sort of business in Adelaide, particularly if you needed workmen. The gold escorts were the eventual solution, and the solution, among others, was proposed by George Tinlin, who was the acting manager of the South Australian Banking Company. Through his intervention and the passing of the Bullion Act, the Adelaide Mint was sent up, and over the 2 years, 1852-53, the gold escorts brought over £2 million worth of gold back to South Australia, which otherwise wouldn't have been here. And interstate, the gold rushes spurred people to glorious excesses, but South Australia didn't have that much gold and wasn't given that much to excess. And although in the eastern states they were even known to shoe horses with shoes of gold, in Adelaide, when the first of the gold escorts reached the top of Mt Osmond Road, the curb chains on the lead horses were changed for gold ones, and they made their entry to Adelaide resplendent in gold curb chains. And those chains were later turned into bracelets, and one was given to James Chambers and the other to Alexander Tolmer. George Tinlin didn't miss out. He had a subscription raised on his behalf, and he was going to England. They gave him £2,500, which is a staggering amount of money for the time, and they also gave him a sum of £210, which must have been left over, to buy a suitable piece of plate, and they described the inscription which would go on it. Oh my goodness, we're out of sequence again. This was another one of those cups I was telling you about. This is originally a shooting trophy for Harndorf, but if anyone here has attended St Mark's College, they'd recognise it as the St Mark's College Masters Cup. Gavin Walkley of Adelaide bought this in a second-hand shop before the last war for £5. It was a presentation cup for a shooting match at Harndorf in about 1853, and he had the inscription polished off and had St Mark's coat of arms engraved on it, and then he presented it to the club. And although he never wrote down the inscription, he did remember the year of 1853 in the town of Harndorf. So we're very lucky still to have that wonderful cup. There's the Tinlin salver. Thank you to the History Trust for providing me with a photograph. It's a massive thing. I think it must be 70 or 80 centimetres wide, and it was made in England by the firm of Hunt and Roskell, who are one of the leading silversmiths and jewellers in London, and set just below the shield, which carries the inscription, are 2 Adelaide pounds, which I don't know if anyone's ever tried to pry them loose. It's a marvellously detailed engraving showing scenes associated with the gold rush and the passing of the Bullion Act and the gold escorts. The Tinlin salver went to England, or stayed in England with Tinlin, and then he presented it back to the state in the 1890s, and it returned. More modest pieces were still made locally. Sam Boddington had been the past chief ranger of his Forester's Lodge in 1853, so the Foresters gave him an appropriate jewel to wear, and that is about, from top to bottom, about 20 centimetres, so about 8 inches. Quite a magnificent piece of jewellery for him to be wearing. The next on our cast of goldsmiths to arrive was Joachim Matthias Wendt. He turned up here in 1854. He was a very well-trained craftsman from Schleswig-Holstein, and Schleswig-Holstein was in an area of considerable political upheaval at that time. He fled to Adelaide, shared a shop for a short time in Perry Street with a musical instrument seller, then moved into Rundle Street, and his family firm was there until 10 years ago, and unfortunately it's not there now. He was to live out all his main 19th century competitors and founded a flourishing business, and his name is a byword in Adelaide silver. Francis Cadell was credited with his part in opening up the Murray to steam navigation, and a subscription was raised for him, and a London firm created a gold centrepiece for him with figures of kangaroos and emus around the base. We don't have an illustration of that one though, but it was shown in the Illustrated London News of the day as being quite a momentous event. do have something more modest. And this is Henry Weeman's medal. He was a chandler, ship's chandler down at Port Adelaide, and at the time after he'd been in Adelaide for 2 years, he must have made a sudden impact on his lodge, the Duke of York Lodge, and had done his year as Grand Master or whatever. So the lodge members had this medal made for him. Henry Weeman's sail loft, I think, might even still be visible down there. And I know on the front of the book, Discovering Port Adelaide's Past by Brian Samuel, there's an illustration of his shop. There was one more goldsmith to arrive to set the scene for the marvellous flowering of goldsmithery in Adelaide in the 19th century, and that was Heinrich Steiner, and here it came from Hamburg in 1858. There are two important historical relics left to us, in particular from 1859. One is English and is still used each year, and one is Australian, or a bit of a hybrid. The Mayor and Corporation were given a silver punch bowl in 1859. Now, when it was bought, it was a second-hand job lot. It was nearly 100 years old then, and in those days 100 years old didn't necessarily mean antique, it meant old-fashioned and perhaps a little bit cheaper. But nevertheless, George Palmer, Jacob Montefiore, Rakes, Curry and Alexander Elder sent this out as a gift to the Mayor and Corporation of the City of Adelaide to be used every year at a ceremony to commemorate Colonel Light, and it was to be filled with colonial wine, and they were to partake of wine and cakes. I noticed in the last year or two that the council has come in for a little bit of flack over outmoded customs like this, but I think it's delightful and I'd hate to see it lost. The other object which catches our eye for that period is this. Charles Harvey Bagot in 1859 was leaving Adelaide to go to England. He'd been associated with the Kapunda mine since its inception, since its discovery, and he obviously had quite a lot going for as far as public relations with the miners, because this was given by the miners and inhabitants of Kapunda to him when he was leaving. And the people didn't have a lot of notice that it was going to be required and that he was leaving. So from Adelaide post haste, William Austin, the artist, was sent up to draw sketches of the mine, and he rushed back with his sketches, and then Fernharbour made this cut, or at least that's what the papers said at the time. In fact, the newspaper said, Mr. Fernharbour has added thereby another laurel to his reputation as an artificer in precious metals. The lid, it said, was an exact miniature of the busiest parts of the mine, shows the bull engine and the engine houses, shear legs, whim, capstan, two shafts, etc. The capstan turns and the mine bell rings. What the newspaper didn't realise was that in his haste, Fernharbour took an English cup, the worn hallmarks are still visible on it, and either remanufactured the lid or made an entirely new lid for it. And it's a marvellously detailed little view of the Kapunda mine as it was then. And that little mine is such a marvellous engine room of economic benefit for South Australia. Julius Schomburg is really underrepresented in our story, and pieces with his mark on them can be counted probably on fingers of one hand. He had an outstanding ability as a designer and a craftsman, but as often happens, it wasn't matched by his ability as a businessman. He won a medal at the International Exhibition in London in 1862, but that's because there's the medal. But not the medal he won, that's the medal he mounted in 1862. A group of local farmers from around Mount Barker in 1851 had entered an exhibit of wheat at the Crystal Palace exhibition in London, the great international exhibition of the products of all nations, and they won that large medal you can see there. It came back here and then it fell prey to the committee system because there were 7 exhibitors who'd forwarded wheat and no one could quite work out who should have the medal, so it hung in abeyance for quite a long time, and eventually they had it mounted by Julius Schomburg, and it was presented to the South Australian Institute and ended up as you see it today in the art gallery. Ridley, of course, was famous for his invention of the stripper, the harvester, that is if you don't get in contact with the descendants of John Ratham's bull, and his grateful fellow colonists presented him with that marvellous thing, which was created by Julius Schomburg. It's a centrepiece which can now be seen probably, I think, at the library at Waite Institute. It certainly was there recently. It's very allegorical. It's got the native figures, it's got the native animals, it's got malachite plaques around the base, fern leaves, clam shells, the wheat which form the sconces for the candles to sit in, a little malachite tablet up on top, set in that gilded wheat sheaf, and then on top a miniature gold reaper. It was a wonderful thing to be given. He was given that in 1861, and then he entered it in the exhibition in 1862 to show what could be made in his home state. When Dominic Daly laid the foundation stone, Sir Dominic Daly laid the foundation stone of the Adelaide Town Hall in 1863, he used this trowel. And the trowel was presented back by his descendants in the 1890s. And what's very attractive about this trowel, apart from the engraving of the facade of the town hall as they hoped it would appear complete with clock, was that the engraver added his name to it, which is a very rare event, they're usually anonymous, engraved the maker's name in full, C.E. Fernharbour, manufacturer, the architect's name of Edmund Wright, but Thomas Warsnott made sure that his name was on there in larger print than anyone else's. Went by now was well established in Adelaide, and it's felt that he already had a working relationship with Julius Schomburg, because Went was a very skillful businessman. He also had reliable contacts in New Zealand, and so he made an outstanding exhibit to send to the Dunedin exhibition of 1864-65. This centrepiece was the star attraction, and along with it there were 2 tatzers, a claret jug, 2 mounted emu eggs, and 3 sets of malachite and gold earrings and brooches. This was known as the Dunedin centrepiece, and it won awards and great acclaim at Dunedin, and in fact it was such a popular and well recognised piece that Went worked it quite hard. He sent it to the Melbourne Intercolonial Exhibition 1866-67, then he shook it across to the Sydney Intercolonial in 1870, the Colonial and Indian in London in 1886, and it was probably in the Adelaide Jubilee Exhibition 1887. And as far as we know, this wonderful thing stayed with the firm until the firm disintegrated about 10 years ago, and then unfortunately it was offered for sale and passed out of the state. The detail on it is wonderful. It can be used like that to hold candles or to have the glass bowls as a table centrepiece. And right down to the tippy toes of it, it's a lovely piece of work, and it's probably since I've been looking at the field, the thing I regret most having left the state. Although the English trade with its massive manufacturing presence dominated the sale of silverwork last century in Australia, the local makers are still called upon from time to time to fill gaps in people's cutlery services or when there was a presentation needed. That gravy ladle must have padded out someone's cutlery service and was produced in the workshops of Fernharbour. When Richard Schomburg was leaving Gawler, they needed something altogether more grand. He'd been in Gawler since 1849, and then in 1865 he won the position as director of the Adelaide Botanic Gardens. He was a very well qualified botanist. He'd studied in Berlin and at the Royal Gardens at Potsdam. He'd accompanied his, probably on a world scale, more famous brother Robert on some of his exploration and gathering expeditions. And while he was in Gawler, being a farmer and a vigneron, he'd also taken over the post as curator of the Gawler Town Museum. So the people were very sorry to see him go, even though it was just 25 miles or so down the road. And they had this cup made for him as a testimonial and presented it at a grand dinner in Gawler. Although it bears the markings that were used in the Went workshop, it bears a lot of decorative detail which seems to indicate that Julius had a strong hand in the design. And this is what we would have expected of his brother. Julius was certainly at the presentation when it was given to him. And in the feet, some more detail of a type which Julius used and none of the others that we know of did. Now, the Adelaide Gallery in 1945 was given by Miss Peacock a gold bangle. Stunning piece of work. I don't know how anyone risked wearing it and bending the leaves. And again, we think that's probably a Julius Schomburg piece. Absolutely lovely thing. George Coppin was still in the mid-1860s involved in the theatrical trade, and at that stage he was promoting in Adelaide a theatrical couple from England, Sir William and Lady Don, talented professional actors who gathered quite a strong supporting in Adelaide. In fact, so reluctant was the public to see them go that, as a gesture of respect and esteem, they presented Lady Don with a gold, silver and malachite mounted emu egg combination inkwell and jewellery case. Must have been a nightmare to dust, but I suppose it lived under a glass dome. And the inscription on it said, "Presented to Lady Don by the citizens of Adelaide as a token of respect and esteem." This was another Went production, and this illustration came from one of the illustrated Melbourne papers of the day. Such things were quite often recorded in the popular press, but little things like that weren't. That was probably a christening mug from the Steiner workshop, and because there was no inscription on it, it could be quite hard to date. There wasn't a methodical series of hallmarks the way the English system worked. But fortunately, around the same time, a boot company won a prize at the agricultural show for its exhibit of boots, and it was almost exactly the same cup, but with the date engraved on it. So we can date that quite confidently to the mid-1860s. 1867 was a very important year for Henry Fuller, who was then the Mayor of Adelaide, and for Mrs. Fuller, because that was the year their son Henry was born. And some of the councillors, led by William Bundy, clubbed together and made a gesture which hadn't been seen in Adelaide before, but which evidently was at one stage traditional in England, and that was when the Lady Mayoress gives birth during the reign of her husband. She's given a cradle as a commemoration, and this is a miniature silver cradle, 10 or 12 inches long, which was presented to Fuller. Of course, 1867 was a year of much grander affairs. That was the year of His Royal Highness Alfred the Duke of Edinburgh making the first British royal visit to Australia, and what is more, making his initial landfall in Adelaide, and what is more, causing a terrible bun fight between Glenelg and Port Adelaide over where he should get on and where he should get off. It was a wonderful year for the goldsmiths because there was a sudden rush of commissions for them. Went was in a very good position to service that because he'd just got a lot of display goods back from the Melbourne Intercolonial Exhibition, so he had a very good stock. There was this frenzy of bonfires being set up around the hills and then fired on false alarms, and people blaming each other and looking for the miscreants. There were foundation stones to be prepared, such as the one out here. There were arches to be erected, ceremonies to be arranged, and declarations of undying loyalty to be inscribed on vellum. And the Went workshop made hay while the sun shone. I think very few goldsmiths in Adelaide at the day would have been idle, but certainly Went got the cream of the orders that came in. The Corporation of the City of Adelaide needed a wonderful casket. The Civil Service needed a wonderful casket. The good burghers of Gawler sent a deputation down to see if they could get a casket made in the shape of a reaper for £45 or less in 10 days or less. And in fact they did. It was a working model of a reaper that they eventually presented to the Duke when he visited the town. And of course there were gold trowels needed. The Victoria Tower of the Adelaide GPO, the new tower, needed a gold trowel so that he could properly lay the foundation stone. And of course Prince Alfred College needed one too. And one of the local scribes in one of the papers of the time, it was Pasquin, Eustace Mitford, wrote at the time that John Wesley would have looked askance at this sudden rush of gold trowels for a Wesleyan college when in 1776 he said, "I have two silver spoons in London and 2 in Bristol, and that is all I have need of until the hungry are cared for." But they got their gold trowel here. And when the Galatea sailed away, it took away this marvellous booty, and then unfortunately 30 years later the Duke moved house and had a grand clearing sale and they all went out. And there's a hunt at the moment to track them down. There's also a hunt to try and find some illustrations of them, and so far we haven't found one. All these grand presentations to the great and good of the colony rubbed Eustace Reveley Mitford up the wrong way. He wrote under the name of Pasquin, and he ran a journal in Adelaide for about 3 years in the mid-1860s. And he came up with a wonderful idea for a testimonial for a politician who he obviously didn't like. And because these testimonials were laden with allegorical detail, he came up with some beauties, but you'll have to forgive my Latin because I've forgotten all I ever knew. And what he suggested be given to this politician was a testimonial presented by all the influential inhabitants of the colony, silver gilt gallows on a malachite safe, broken open, emblematic figure in pure gold of South Australia, hanging by the neck, with a legend Swindlus edax rerum, and at the base an allegorical group of universal suffrage, all drunk and disorderly, with a motto Vox Nobuli, Vox Rascalorum. And if anyone would like to translate for me afterwards, I'll be most grateful. The last work we have from the hands of Julius Schomburg is this one, and it dates from the time, probably 1867, because it's not inscribed, when he seems to have been in a fairly brief partnership with one Mayer, who was an importer and I think also family friend who had a business in Grenfell Street. And this is called the Schomburg Mayer Cup, and I think it's one of the treasures of the Adelaide Gallery. It doesn't have his stamps on it, but it has very finely engraved on the foot rim that it came from Schomburg and Mayer. And that was given to the Adelaide Art Gallery in its centenary year by Southern Farmers Group, I think. It's one of a group of 3 wonderful pieces of silver. After this, incidentally, Mayer was the importer who brought in the wonderful glass house in the Botanic Gardens, which was restored only recently. After this, Julius, according to family tradition, vanished into the Went workshop, probably for about 30 years. And Went, I think, built his reputation to a certain extent on the wonderful things which Julius Schomburg was able to produce. One other thing which we do have that Julius produced, and this is going back in time, was a Hanson Cup of 1862, when Richard Davies Hanson quit politics to become a member of the bench, become Chief Justice. And he had a most marvellous large either vase or lidded cup made for him, and it was designed by Julius, largely made by Fernhaber, but the design work and some of the work was done by Julius, and that lives in Sydney. It's a massive cup, about 40 centimetres high and 3 kilograms in weight, and it's been lost from its salver for many, many years, and that salver turned up unrecognised under someone's bed in Adelaide a year or 2 ago. When they found out how much it may be worth, they thrust it into the bank and it's never been seen again. As a postscript to the visit of the Duke in Edinburgh came the news early in 1868 that there had been an assassination attempt on him at Clontarf in Sydney, and a courageous bystander, a Mr. Vile, tackled the miscreant and got a bullet in the foot as a result. And there were huge outpourings of shock and shame and rage against the Fenians who were blamed. And the Cornish ladies of South Australia presented Mr. Vile with a silver-mounted emu egg as a gesture of respect and esteem for his bold attempt. But this was made by the Melbourne maker Edwards, not Adelaide. This is another less dramatic presentation, and it was made in Harndorf in 1869. It's engraved in German, and it shows that it was presented to the secretary of the Krankenverein, or the Sickness Society. At this stage, there being no government benefits in South Australia of any sort really, people belonged to things like Oddfellows Lodges as a mutual support. They could get doctors' bills paid by their shilling a week or whatever it was subscription, but the Lutherans weren't able to join those lodges. It was a religious stricture that they couldn't, and so they set up both the German hospital in Adelaide and also the Krankenverein, or Sickness Society, which operated the same way in effect as the Friendly Societies did. Robert Strenz was the initial secretary in 1866 when it was set up. He was also the librarian at the Harndorfer Deutsche Institute and the teacher of the Lutheran Day School at Harndorf, which acted as a primary section of the Lutheran Academy. Also, when the Duke of Edinburgh came and visited Harndorf, he spoke on behalf of the inhabitants in German to the Duke. He was a very active member of the community, very well recorded, but unfortunately, after the expansion of the school, he ran into financial difficulties and died by his own hand in 1871. John Septimus Roe was a more heroic figure in Australian exploration. He was a Royal Navy captain, and he has been called in the Australian Dictionary of Biography father of Australian explorers. He had a leaky little ship called the Mermaid of 85 tonnes, and he circumnavigated Australia, filling in the gaps in the charts which had been left by Cook and Flinders before him. He also did some inland exploration, and then he was asked to take over the post of Surveyor General at the Swan River Colony, and he applied for 2 years' leave of absence from the Admiralty and stretched it out to 40. And then on his retirement in 1870, his friends in the survey department wanted to make a suitable gesture as he left, and there were no jewellers in Perth capable of making anything on a large scale, so they imported from Adelaide, in fact from Mr. Went's workshop, that centrepiece which was given to him. And one of the interesting things about it is the figure climbing up. You can see an Aboriginal figure climbing up on the right-hand side, and that's the same cast that was used on one of the figures on the Ridley candelabrum, and we believe that points to, again, Julius working in Went's workshop. There's also another bit of importing going on, and that was when the ladies of Kapunda at Christchurch wished to present the Reverend T. Jasper Smith with a salver. They came to Adelaide and bought this salver from Steiner and presented it to him. And although it has Steiner's marks on, it also has some other marks which show a foreign origin, and some of the decoration on it couldn't have been done in Adelaide at the time. it was quite sophisticated machinery decorating, and that couldn't be done here, the machine wasn't here. So Steiner had imported that, put his own name on it, and then sold it. This wasn't entirely uncommon. It's an occurrence in the jewellery trade, which still goes on. Was another one of the Southern Farmers pieces presented to the Adelaide Gallery. That was made by Steiner. The whole thing closed up, and then when you pressed the emu finial down, it popped open, and inside were your two perfume bottles made of Queensland beans, which were something of an object of novelty. They were turned into perfume bottles and vesta cases. And Steiner made those in Adelaide. That's one of his finest. And William Edwards made them in Melbourne. And at the moment we don't actually know who was the originator of that idea. But I think they'd be a nightmare to use, maybe knocking it over. The vineyards near Gawler at that time were producing Tokay and Hock among their other goods, and it's quite possible that wine label by Steiner was made to go around the neck of a decanter or a bottle of Hock from that area. Other small items which were quite favourites in households were napkin rings. The one on the left is one by Steiner, and the one on the right is from about 20 years later, maybe the 1890s, and is engraved with scenes of Broken Hill. Broken Hill was a great tourist attraction and famous for its wealth, and it has a mining scene of the town engraved on it. Peter Bonnen, among others, was a minor explorer and the honorary secretary of the Adelaide Hunt Club, the members of which gave him this cup in 1872. It's a very European piece from Steiner's workshop, and it stands in the Adelaide Gallery now in conjunction with three other very fine cups in a small group, which is probably the best group in Australia of that kind of work. In 1873, the popular postmaster at Albany in Western Australia retired, and the locals had to fall back on an Adelaide supplier. And they sent over to Adelaide, to Went, for a centrepiece, and the papers said that this was the third large piece of silver that he'd sent west. He also provided this inkstand, and the members of Samuel Way's office gave him that when he was elevated to the bench. It's a very fine little Went piece with very typical Adelaide use of inlaid malachite, and Justice Way was thoughtful enough to leave that to the art gallery in his will. It's a bit more elaborate than his father's humble spoon. Bishop Augustus Short wasn't entirely pleased in 1876 when his friends and admirers gave him a centrepiece. It's a massive thing. You can see it there. It's standing in the art gallery at the moment. It came with that mirrored plateau, with a salver, with two silver-mounted flower vases, and a silver-mounted emu egg for his wife Millicent. On the base there, although they're not very clear, are the figures of faith, hope and charity. And in a letter of the time he wrote quite crossly, "I have got home my white elephant, candelabrum, etc. It's been necessary to widen the drawing room bookcase, get a marble slab and get a large glass case made for it, like one of those in Steiner's shops, and all this will cost a great deal." I think he would have rather had the money. It must have been a wonderful commission for Steiner. And this was another Steiner commission, a much smaller but a much finer detailed piece of 1877. William Thurston at that stage worked at G&R Wills's warehouse in Adelaide, and he left there to go and live in Mount Gambier. So his co-workers presented him with this beautiful little centrepiece, and he took it to Mount Gambier with him, became publican and mayor down there, and eventually it found its way back as the gift of the Friends of the Adelaide Gallery to the Adelaide Gallery in 1986. The year Thurston took that down to Mount Gambier, Thomas Corker, who was a local mail contractor, won this cup in a horse race in Mount Gambier itself. Went had a branch down there from 1869 to about 87, and was obviously in a very good position to supply the townspeople with things like trophy cups. Corker was a local mail contractor for 60 years. He served around Mount Gambier and the Victorian border towns, and he also drove at one stage for Cobb & Co, but his moment of fame really was when he drove the future King George V up to Penola in 1881. He won the horse racing trophy, kept it, and then in old age presented it to a young friend over the border at Casterton, and it still lives in that young friend's house. William Bundy of Adelaide came out in the late 1840s. His family had been a very wealthy one in England, but then they'd had a series of financial disasters and fled to the colonies to regather and hopefully regather their wealth. And he started work in a solicitor's office at the age of 10. He worked himself up until he became both a parliamentarian and a judge, and one of the founders of the South Australian Yacht Club in 1869. He won this for sailing, which was his great passion, when it was presented by the Glenelg Yacht Club in 1877. And we came across Bundy before because he was the instigator of the buying of the Fuller baby cradle. 1878, and another one of those marvellous 19th century exhibitions of the industries and works of all nations took place in Paris. And this was an engraving from one of the illustrated papers of the time of the South Australian court there. And prominent in the front, those two great rivals, Steiner on the left and Went on the right, with their showcases full of silver-mounted emu eggs, claret jugs, jewellery, and other gewgaws and highly priced bits of nonsense. It must have been a wonderful showing, and interestingly enough, at that Paris exhibition, the only other Australian jeweller to show was a Melbourne one with a much, much inferior exhibit. Adelaide really seemed to be leading the field at that time. During the prosperous years leading up to 1880, it seemed bank managers couldn't do much wrong. In fact, they were able to win the hearts and minds of their clients, and they were fairly frequent recipients of grand presentations. George Turnbull had been manager of the National Bank in Mount Gambier for 4 years in 1879 when he got his moving orders. So the locals trotted into Wentz and had something grand made in Adelaide, which was this, 100 guinea Epernon salver, and a local photographer photographed it and distributed photographs at the ceremony, and that is taken from one of the original photographs. Again, probably a piece about 2 feet high and probably a couple of 100 ounces of silver and a very handsome salver at the front. This tea caddy is fairly plain, but I think it's absolutely delightful. It's from the Went workshop, about 1880, and of particular interest is the coat of arms on the front. It was used by the Angus family of Anguston. That was an assumed coat of arms. They used it up until about the turn of the century, but it hadn't been granted by the College of Arms in England. The colonial gentry very often found that it added to their gravitas to have armorial bearings, and they assumed them when they felt they could. And in fact, John Howard Angus, the second son of George Fife, got his own grant of arms early this century, but it was quite a lot different to that one. The Elders and the Bar Smiths and the Anguses were wonderful mainstays for the jewellery firms of Adelaide during those great years. And in 1881, Robert Bar Smith was president of the Adelaide Hunt Club, and as president, it was his prerogative, duty or obligation or honour to present the Adelaide Hunt Club Cup. And in 1881, he had Steiner produce that wonderfully elegant gold claret jug, which was run for. And unfortunately, that turned up in Adelaide about 15 years ago and was spirited off in the state. The following year, he was president of the South Australian Coursing Club. And so he presented the coursing dogs with an appropriate trophy, a very elegant Went ewer or claret jug, and that was run for at Buckland Park in 1882. But things were starting to go a bit bad. The jewellers' shops were still extremely good. In Richard Tuppenny's book of 1883, Town Life in Australia, which was published in London, we have a good account of what was to be the last great flourish of the goldsmiths' trade in Adelaide. Comparing the shops in Adelaide with those in the eastern capitals, he wrote, "Of the shops there isn't much to be said, with the one exception of those of the jewellers and silversmiths, the work of which is both original and artistic, throwing altogether into the shade similar shops in Melbourne and Sydney." And then he went on to say, "Messrs Steiner and Went silverware and jewellery shops have a style on their own which does them immense credit." But the good times were coming to an end. He also wrote, "But few families have any large quantity of plate. An electro has almost entirely superseded silver. Metal is not common for dishes and entirely unknown for plates." In the early 1880s, Steiner was struck by a family tragedy when his 2 sons and his wife died, and he wanted to sell up and go back to Germany. Conditions weren't good. Went was advertising closing down sales, but he didn't manage to close down. And the Adelaide Hunt Club of 1883 was large and imposing and a beautiful thing, but it wasn't gold anymore. It was about 1.7 kilograms of silver. The bank crashes of the 1880s and the droughts took effect. Expensive stock hung around in the shops, and when the survey department in Perth wanted another presentation piece in 1890 because John Forrest was leaving, they bought from Adelaide, from August Brunkhorst, who'd taken over Steiner's business, this claret jug and salver. Quite plain, as fashion was turning at the time, but still with Steiner's marks on it, show that it had been in stock for 4 or 5 years by then. Brunkhorst was a silversmith with a very fine eye for shape and proportion, and it was at a time when over-ornamentation was no longer required and cost was becoming much more important. Style in England had changed, and his restrained designs reflected that, and his workmanship complemented it. And these 3 pieces from around 1890 show the utilitarian but cool elegance which he put into his work. That's very much a Georgian shape, but a lovely end of the century piece in frosted silver with a gilt interior. The claret jugs were probably horribly impractical. You wouldn't want to clean one inside, but very, very elegant, and a lovely reverse taper on the handle complementing the body. And then what could easily pass as a modern day water jug. Gwent had sold his Mount Gambier business to his manager there in 1887, and only small pieces of jewellery and lodge regalia were made down there. But another local jeweller, Herbert Kessel, made this little whist counter box, perhaps for himself. He made the counters out of shillings turned up on a jeweller's lathe, and then made the little box for them to go in. It's a very delightful little piece of everyday silverware. The advertising photograph of Went here for 1894 shows several important pieces. At the centre in the back is a large centrepiece, the Mount Barker centrepiece, which now lives at Mount Barker, being won as an agricultural prize. It was being exhibited there in 1894, but it would have been made at least 20 and probably 25 years earlier and used as a display piece. The object on the lower right corner is a model of the famous Block 10 mine at Broken Hill. And this lives in the Silverton Museum, but it was a very difficult piece of silver to research. And then when the story was discovered, it became obvious why it was difficult. There had been a serious clash, an industrial clash on the silver fields in 1892 with a major strike. And John Warren of the Block 10 mine, the manager, was given that by his company for his successful resolution of the strike. And I'm sure it would not have gone down well with the workers in the mines if they'd known that the company was splashing that amount of money around on the man who would have been at one stage anyway their enemy. In the background of that little arched photo centre top is a cup with angular handles. That was a Murak trophy. This was presented by a doctor who was also Captain W.J. Brown of Murak Station just out of Mount Gambier, and it was presented in about 1892 or 94 to the local militia as an annual shooting prize. It was used in Mount Gambier for a number of years and then disappeared, and turned up. It was given to the local historian there, Les Hill. He gave it to the council, and the council gave it back on loan to the local military, and it's now held by the local unit of the 27th Royal South Australian Rifles. A forerunner to the great Broken Hill mines was the Silverton field, and in particular the major mine there, which was the Umburumburka. Now this probably functioned not very well, I would suspect, as an inkwell, and it looks likely that it was made for either an office holder or perhaps a field foreman of the Umburumburka Silver and Lead Mining Company. It's a replica of the scales they used to weigh their bagged up ore. When the ore was dug out, it was dressed to get a high concentration of valuable metal, put into bags weighing 200 pounds on the scales, and then it was taken by wagon to the refiner. And that is what I'd say is the story of that. That little inkstand, or whatever it is, has moving parts and only measures 3 or 4 inches high. Went had a shop at Broken Hill from about the late 1880s up until the early 1900s, after he closed the Mount Gambier one, and traded on the name a bit. This belt buckle, has Adelaide and Broken Hill stamped on the back of it, and came from part of the Went collection when it was sold up 10 years ago. Around the turn of the century, small domestic things are still being made. Brunkhorst made that little tea strainer. Went made the card case as a lawn tennis championship prize for ladies. And Went's also made that lovely, very plain, very modern looking tea set, which now lives at the Adelaide Gallery. But their workshop wasn't being called to make the large presentation pieces anymore. The little casts of human figures and animals that they'd turned out so well weren't required. This may have been one of the last things they did. It's a bronze Staffordshire Bull Terrier, a beautiful little thing you can hold in your hand, about 4 inches long. But business really was going down. Steiner had gone back to Germany. Presentation items were still made, but coming into this century, they were only made sporadically. This was in 1914 for turning the first sod of the Port Adelaide tramway, and it's a miniature shovel, only about 31 centimetres or about a foot long. By the time the First World War came around, felt impelled to write to the paper castigating the dastardly Hun and distancing himself from it and pointing out that he had grandchildren on the Allied side fighting. During the war, Bronkhorst died, Steiner died just before, Wendt died during, Fernhaber had died back in the late 70s or early 80s, and Julius Schomburg had unfortunately died in the 1890s, and none of those great silversmithing figures were left to us. And when in 1927 the Adelaide Hunt Club needed its annual cup, it was that Wendt Cup, but it's a cup from about 1900, which was polished off and then re-engraved and recycled. That pretty well takes us to the end of 19th century Australian silver in Adelaide. We have lost a lot. Much has been melted down. Around the time I started collecting, dealers were still sending it off to be melted down because it was worth more for scrap. But we still have a marvellous remainder in the City Council collection, the South Australian Art Gallery, and museums and private homes around Adelaide. The Art Gallery of South Australia was the first public gallery in the country to own a piece of Australian silver, and they got that in 1884. And since then it's added to its holdings through the generosity of the Michelle collection and through quite a lot of lenders and donors. So if you go there and have a look at it, you'll see a number of the pieces there that you've seen here, and I hope you enjoy them as much as I did. Thanks very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Richard's happy to answer any questions. Are there any questions you'd like to put to him?
That marvellous piece of silver that you showed us with the wents and could either have candlesticks or glass bowls in it.
Yes.
You said that had gone out of the state about 10 years ago.
Yes.
Do you know where it went?
Yes, I know the owner interstate, but it's I think a Swiss national living in Australia. Under heritage legislation, I'm sure he wouldn't be able to take it out of the country, but it's certainly sort of not currently available for viewing anymore. And in fact, when I wanted a good photograph of it, that came off the front of a magazine. That's where you could see $5 in the bottom right-hand corner, with the permission of the owner of the photograph, I might add. But it's unfortunate that that and the gold cup have gone. In fact, with the gold cups, we know of at least 4 made in Adelaide by Steiner, superb cups, 3 by Wendt and 2 by other makers. And as far as I know, none of them are in the state now. And there may well be others that we haven't caught up with. And when I say we, I correspond a lot with John Hawkins, who wrote the definitive 2-volume book on Australian silver, and he's been looking for things too. And we're still looking for photographs of Duke of Edinburgh's presents, if anyone has any.
I have a pair of Steiner earrings, and I'm just wondering whether Steiner made very much jewellery.
He made quite a lot of jewellery, and in fact Adelaide, the most likely Adelaide jewellery of that period that you will find would be either Steiner or Wendt. It's not always marked, and if you've still got the original box, that's wonderful. But they're a great thing to have. Quite often they would import Italian micro-mosaic brooches, for example, made of very tiny fragments of inlaid stone, and then they'd be set here in the workshop. But certainly the settings were done here. If it's got his stamp on it, you can be pretty sure he made it here. But if it's just in a Steiner box, he could have imported it.
When the first silver things were being made in South Australia, where was the silver coming from? The raw silver to make the
most common sources of the silver used were either coinage, because it was transposable virtually, hence the laws in England in particular governing the use of it, and melted down, worn out old spoons and so on. People commonly recycled their silver, and in fact the traditional way when people bought silver in England, it would be sold at so much per ounce for the metal, and then so much per ounce for however much work went into it. So if it was a very elaborate thing, there would be a very high work cost, but if it was simple things like spoons or plates, then there'd be much less. And people used that as a store of wealth and would bequeath it to people or sell it in hard times. We saw that recently when the Savings Bank of South Australia silver collection was sold in Adelaide several years ago, the family silver. It wasn't terribly old and it was English, so wasn't too much of a worry.
It was quite striking how many of those early pieces had Aboriginal figures on top. Do you have any comment on the period when that was very common, and have you heard any discussion about why it became common, why it then disappeared?
I don't know why it disappeared, except that I think probably in the earlier years, and they seem to have been on things from perhaps the early 1860s until probably into the early 1890s. I would say originally it may have been partly the, what's the term for it, not glorious savage, or... Yes, exactly. I think there was that feeling about it, and some of the figures were very noble, but unfortunately some of the ones which were made in Went's workshop, for example, could be fairly rough cast, either in bronze or silver, very often in bronze, sometimes blackened, sometimes silvered over, and there wasn't a great deal of attention to detail, and they certainly didn't compliment anyone. But the little centrepiece which we saw after Bishop Short's, which was the first one that went to Mount Gambier, the figures on that are lovely little figures, and I think really they were grouping the Aborigines in with the flora and fauna, but the glamour wore off as the proximity of people to Aborigines and problems increased. I know there's a certain amount of embarrassment about some of those things now.
In a past life I had saw quite a lot of military centerpieces with Indian influences, and I just wonder whether there was any of that flowing through to Australia from the imperial influences in India.
I don't know if there are influences from India, but certainly there was a very vigorous trade between Australia and India, and particularly New South Wales in the early days, and also with China. And both India and China turned out English-style silver for the Western market, sometimes using Western-style markings to make them look all the better. And of course the British regiments in India would buy locally. There were big firms operating throughout the 19th century there, and I've seen quite a bit of Indian regimental silver, British regiments, sold even around Adelaide. But there was quite an export trade both from India and China to Australia. So those things do turn up, but they're more likely to have been brought about by British units serving in India and then travelling on elsewhere.
We can continue discussing silver over supper. I'm sure many people will want to talk to Richard, but for the umpteenth time, I can't think of a better person to move a vote of thanks than another great collector, Maurice Kane, our Vice President.
Thank you very much, Rob. I suppose it could be argued that we've heard something about the golden age of Australian silver. If that's not a contradiction, then I'm happy to say that. Richard Phillips has been a very keen collector, a very keen student, and that's been well illustrated tonight. I think the South Australian history that came out in the talk tonight is something that we have all been thrilled with, and I know that the illustrations with the slides that he's given us has shown us the great artistic work of the silversmiths we had here in South Australia, and of course the use of silver right through the whole period of South Australian history during the 19th century. And I hope that that day may come again when we do see a lot more silver and gold around the place. It's a beautiful material to work with, and the workmanship, of course, that was illustrated tonight, particularly the works by Steiner, Wendt, and the other silversmiths of that period were fascinating. And I think that we've probably had the best way that we possibly can to the introduction of the silver anniversary of our society by a talk from Richard Phillips on the subject of South Australian silver. So on behalf of everyone, I'd like you to show your appreciation to Richard Phillips for a most enthralling talk, and we thank him very much indeed.